IVM.
Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of the Musafir Stories, India's very own travel podcast, where each week we discuss the story of travelers in their own words and relive their experiences with you, our listeners. Hey guys, welcome to a brand new episode of the Musafir Stories. Hope you all are well and keeping safe. Thank you so much for your continued love and support for the podcast. It gives us all the motivation to keep going. If you haven't already done so, make sure to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, and please do share it with your friends and family. Word of mouth is the best way to help us reach more people. On the podcast today, we have one of the top travel bloggers in the country, Lakshmi Sharath, as she takes us on a fascinating road trip uncovering the east coast of India. So buckle up and come along. So with that introduction, we'd love to welcome Lakshmi Sharath from the blog Travel with Lakshmi or lakshmisharath.com. Lakshmi, thank you so much for being a part of the podcast, a part of the Musafir Stories, and it's a real honor and a long time dream and objective of us as well to get you on the podcast. Really glad to have you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be part of Musafir Stories. I've been listening to your podcast, and it's amazing because I think you're one of the earliest to bring so many travelers on the fore. So many people who've had wanderlust and who are great, offer great inspiration. I'm so honored to be part of Musafir Stories.
Thank you, Lakshmi. Likewise, and really respect the work you do. And it's thanks to travel writers like you that Musafir Stories has actually been possible, right? Otherwise, without you folks, without great guests like you, Musafir Stories would have been nowhere. It wouldn't even have been born. So really thank you for being on the platform and taking time to come talk to us. But the introduction I gave about you initially was very short and concise. Why don't you speak a little bit more about your blog when you started, and also how this whole thing started?
So, I've always been a writer. So since I was, 12 or 13 years old, I've always been interested in writing. And I always had a very, I was always curious. I always wanted to travel. I wanted to see places. I was always, even when I was a kid, my mother used to say that I had wheels on my feet and I would always be restless and exploring and running away and, discovering new things, talking to new people. There was always that element of curiosity in me. I started writing travel stories in my little journal when I was in school, college. And I also used to start doing a little bit of articles in newspaper. And so when I was in my college, I got an opportunity to work with a neighborhood newspaper. So two girls, we started, kind of running around a particular locality, looking for news. And at that time, travel was not so much like a destination driven, but for me, it was all about people and people's stories. Mm-hmm. In 2005, when blogs, suddenly became very, it was something very innovative. People were curious about the platform. And I was a media professional. I used to be in television and radio, and I was working for a radio station at that time. And I didn't get opportunity to, write about my travel experiences. I needed a platform to do that. And I was also very curious about the internet. And I was wondering what it would be like if I had my own little space on the internet, my own little identity on the internet, and also that identity talking about my travel experiences. So that is how the whole blog came up, because it became like a place for me to share my travel stories, my wanderlust, the people I met during my travels, the places I stayed, the little nuggets of information. And during having a day job, you're constantly running from one meeting to another. Sometimes I would travel on work and I would just, escape in between meetings to go see a place or check out something interesting. And then that would become a part of my blog. So that's how it all began, actually. This was way back, I would say, in 2005, when I don't think, people were even thinking of blogs at that point of time.
Yeah, you're also one of the I guess, early adopters of blogs and travel writing as well. You've been in the space for a long, long time, and that's why it's a high point for the Musafir Stories too to have you on the podcast and talk to you and your experiences. But having said that, where are you planning on taking us and our listeners to today?
See, I have traveled all across India and I've also been to so many countries. But for me, my heart belongs to my own state, which is Tamil Nadu. And I grew up in Madras, what I call Madras, it's Chennai, but I still call it Madras. And the sea has always been something fascinating, right? I mean, for me, even though I live in Bangalore today, I miss the ocean, I miss the waves. And so it was one of my dreams to kind of explore these, little villages and little towns, some of them lost, some of them popular, along the coastline, the Coromandel coastline. And while I was researching on this road trip that I wanted to do, I realized that a lot of these towns were former colonies of the European powers. And interestingly, I realized Tamil Nadu was one state which had almost all the colonial powers, from not just the British and the French, but the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Danish. I mean, almost everybody had a colony at some point or time or the other. And in fact, the irony was that Madras or Chennai itself was owned by multiple colonies. At one time, it was a French settlement. At one time, it was a Portuguese settlement. At one time, it had the British and the Portuguese. So, there was so much of history. Like, imagine two parts of the city owned by two different colonies, and today it's all one seamless city. So, I wanted to actually do a road trip and visit these colonies. Like I said, some of these are lost, forgotten towns, and they're just fishing hamlets today. Some are, of course, tourist centers. But I wanted to do a road trip from Chennai to Nagapattinam. And I called it the Coromandel colonies, and I went on this road trip, with my husband. And it was an amazing experience.
Wonderful. It sounds really, really exciting as well. And Tamil Nadu itinerary is always exciting for me as I keep calling out. My mom's family is actually from Salem in Tamil Nadu.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I still have some family there. So I always get a little excited when we do a itinerary in Tamil Nadu. Tell us a little bit more about this trip that you did, Lakshmi. How long of a trip was this? How long was it spread out for? And what's a good time to travel, or somebody wanting to make this trip or a similar trip like this?
So see, it was almost 300 kilometers, right, from Chennai to Nagapattinam by road. So obviously, you go through Pondicherry, and for a lot of people, it's either Chennai or Pondi. These were the two hubs that everybody was familiar with, okay? And that Pondi was a French settlement, and not many people understand that Chennai was, one of the earliest centers of the British East India Company. So there's even a lot of history still left in the city, from the whole, the Fort Museum, for instance, where Robert Clive got married, to the oldest Anglican church. So these were some of the nuggets of information that I had initially collected when I started my travel. But then I realized that there's so many little towns, like for example, there was Sadras, which is near Kalpakam. Then there was, Alamparai, just before Pondicherry. Then there was Kadalur, because a lot of people are familiar with Kadalur, but there is an old Kadalur and there were stories around it. Then there was Porto Novo, which is Parangipete, which is, a Portuguese settlement. And then you had, of course, Trangubar or Tarangambadi, which is now one of the a tourist, destinations. But it is really a sleepy hamlet, and so these were places that excited me, and I started, driving through them. Ideally, you could do this over a week, you could do this over 3-4 days. It depends entirely on how much you want to stop and pause and enjoy on your journey. Some of these places were just like, it was mostly en route for me. Like Parangipete was just a stop. Kadalur, I went looking for Fort David, which was a British old post, so as to speak, and I couldn't find it at all. And then we went to Old Kadalur, which was completely like in the middle of nowhere, and found like some booth bungalows there. And so, these things take a lot of time. A trip like this can be anywhere between 3 to 4 days to even a week. And one could look at places like maybe have a stopover at Pondi and have a stopover at Tranquebar, and then just drive around these areas.
Yep, yeah, definitely. And also, given where this is situated as well, right? Tamil Nadu is usually hot during the summer, so perhaps sometimes later in the year would be an ideal time to make the trip, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, so I would think that anytime, one should avoid obviously the peak summer, but like they say, Tamil Nadu has hot, hotter, and hottest.
Yeah.
So peak summer and the cyclone months to be avoided, obviously, because you're going to the ocean area. So yeah, so if you're looking at time, I would look at maybe any time between after June to about Feb is a great time, minus the cyclonic period.
Sure. Thanks for calling that out. And also, just as a little bit of context, like you were calling out, right? The Coromandel Coast has been really, really the hub of a lot of these trading activity, right? Basically, that's how a lot of these colonial powers started coming to India as well to trade. Primarily, it would be the spices and things like that. That was, I guess, a lot more in the Malabar coast, but on the east coast as well, a lot of things like cloth and special kinds of textile and things like that. A lot of things, that's how everything started, but eventually it turned out into bigger settlements, and some of them ended up staying well beyond the initial remit that they came here for, right? Especially the Britishers, they were here for a long, long time after. And while I was reading up, just a little bit of a background as well, Coromandel, right? I believe there's a couple of stories or etymology of the name itself. One was Chola Mandalam, because Cholas actually ruled this place for the longest time, right, during the initial periods after the first century. But the other one was also that a place called Kari Mandalam, or it is a village, I believe, somewhere along the coast as well. So it could be just a corruption of the one of those two terms, either Chola Mandalam or Karai or Kari Mandalam. So the Coromandel, that's how the origin of the word is, what we refer to the eastern coast of India that basically spreads across the coast of Tamil Nadu and parts of Andhra Pradesh as well to a certain extent. Tell us a little bit more about how you started off, and Chennai is the base where you said you started off. Like, do you spend some time looking around any of the places of the colonial interest, I would say, within Chennai as well, or did you? Because Chennai itself can be an episode of on by its own, right? There's so much in terms of the history and the layers. But how did you do in this particular trip? Did you check out places in Chennai too as a part of the itinerary?
Of course, although I've brought up Madras and I've seen almost most of these places, I had to start from Chennai. So I started obviously not just from the Marina Beach, but but from the I went to the old secretariat. We got some permission to see some of the monuments there, like the Fort Museum and the Anglican Church. And this was the old Fort St. George. This is where the British settlement started. But like I mentioned, historically, the French and the Portuguese were the first to come here. And there are the whole Santhome area and that side was eventually a Portuguese settlement. And even prior to the Portuguese coming, you have, St. Thomas Mount, and, so there is a lot of, history there. There's a lot of interesting churches. There's even an Armenian church, for instance, in Paris Corner. And there's a whole concept when the British took over. There is this whole white town and, black town. And there were also nuggets, areas in Chennai. Like you said rightly, it was textiles that brought, the Europeans here. And so they needed a lot of artisans and weavers. And so there were localities, in the Black Town or what, which had a lot of artisans and weavers living. And and the whole area of trade, because that's why the Armenians were here, because it became a very, Chennai was the hub of a lot of trade as well. So I started with Chennai, with Madras, and I started with Fort St. George. I started driving through some of these old localities that I mentioned, like Chandadripet. I also went into the Santhome area, which had the whole Portuguese. So we drove, anyway through the beach road, we had to drive down. So we visited some of the monuments in that space, and then from there we carried on towards Mahabalipuram, which is the Pallava port. But I didn't stop at Mahabalipuram. In fact, because since this was about Coromandel colonies, I wanted to stick to the Coromandel, the colonies that were European powers. So we took a detour and went to this place called Madras, also called Madrasapattinam, and it was a Dutch colony. So this was my first destination in the Coromandel colonies tours.
Okay. I'll be honest, I hadn't heard of this, but apparently it's also sometimes referred to as the twin city of Madras, right? Sadras like Madras, yeah?
Yeah, so Sadras as Madras. Okay,
Yeah.
so, but the original name is Madrasapattinam. And here you can see a restored 17th century Dutch fort. You can also see a cemetery. But ironically, it was a battlefield. It was actually where the Battle of Sadras was fought between the British and the French and the Dutch. And
Right.
so there was a lot of European politics that happened around the same time in Europe, right? So all this used to reflect in their colonies. So whenever there was a war in Europe, there would be repercussions out here. So the Battle of Sadras was also, kind of one of the reflections of the wars that were happening in Europe. You could still feel the entire, the battlefield. You can see the cannons here. You can see watchtowers. You can see warehouses. But even more fascinating is you could see the tombs in the cemetery. And this was something very, very interesting for me. They say that the British fleet actually lost the war, but the story goes that Madrasapattinam eventually became part of the British East India Company.
Yeah, very interesting. And yeah, like you rightly mentioned, I think it'll be a theme across the coast and a lot of the places, the points you stopped at as well, right? Like, I guess just a little snippet of history, right? Like a lot of things happening and going on here. You dig a little deeper and you'll find the connections in these places. A lot of these forts, in terms of the upkeep of them, Lakshmi, did you find that they were in a decent enough condition, or what was the overall state of these forts?
So it's been restored and it's definitely well maintained. But I think it could do with better, like for example, there was no watchman when I went. I mean, there was a watchman, sorry, when I went, but there was no guide there. You have a lot of random guys posting as guides, and they'll immediately want to tell you stories. I even met one of those shady characters. This is an issue. It's very safe. It's a part of a town. Madrasapattinam actually has a history even older than the colonial history. It used to be part of the Vijayanagar, and even before that, it has Chola connections as well, and it is a weaving center. It was known for muslin. So, like I mentioned, all this was war for textiles, right? So it is even now a small bustling town. So it's safe in that sense. But like I said, I wish there was a guide, someone who would actually tell you stories, actually bring the place alive.
Sure.
But then, it's maintained very well. There's a good watchman out there. It's an ASI monument and all of that. And it is very fascinating to, wander around the cemetery, look at some of the, war memorabilia, as we might say.
Yeah.
But Madrasapattinam is not still very touristy. Sadras
Sure.
is not, it's very much close to Mahabalipuram, but not many people know about it.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for calling that out. And after spending some time here, what was your next pit stop moving on from Sadras or Madrasapattinam?
So we were heading to Pondicherry from here, and and there's a board which where it says Kadapakam. That's the name of the village, and there's a little board which says Alamparai. So Alamparai is another fort, and it's a ruins of a fort, which is actually on the beach. It's right on the beach. You have to drive through this village. It's a little detour from the main road, from the main highway. You have to drive through this village. You'll see a lot of markets, and you'll see a lot of women selling fish. And then when you go a little interior, you'll almost see these backwaters. You'll see fishing nets. It gets quieter and quieter, except for the sound of the breeze. And then you see, the ruins of this fort. Alampare was not. Interestingly, is not a colonial colony or It was not a place which was owned by any of the colonial powers. Interestingly, it is actually built during the Mughal era. It was ruled by the Nawab of Carnatic, but it was
Okay.
gifted to the French for their support. You know,
I
so
see.
like I said, there were always constant wars happening among the European powers, and the locals rulers used to choose which side they
Right.
were on. So the Nawab of Carnatic at that point of time decided to, support the French, and they were together. And so this was part of this was gifted to the French. They say that there was even a mint nearby, and the Arcot Nawabs used to use it, and it used to be a trade port. Zari, salt, ghee, all these were exported from here. There's a lot of coins that were minted here. And then there's even like old temples, and there was like a little like a chowltree, a place for travelers to rest, kind of a thing.
Right.
But unfortunately, you don't see any of this now. They say the British destroyed the fort eventually. So you just see some broken remnants. You see some bricks here and there. It's very quiet. And you can go on a little boat ride in the ocean if you want. But I would advise that don't go alone if you're a solo traveler, or if you're just a couple traveling. It's not maybe the best idea because it's very isolated. If
Right.
you're going, it's better to go in a group. But it's just nice to just sit there and just take in the atmosphere. Imagine what this whole place would have been like. I mean, just imagine, you just see a smattering of a few trees and some broken bricks, and you see the ocean, and you see some boats here, and you just wonder, oh my God, at some point of time, there would have been a mint here, there would have been a chowltree here, there would have been a big fortress here, and it would have been a very bustling town. Yeah, so that was my second stop, Alamparai. It's on the way to Pondicherry. It's in fact, there's 50 kilometers from here to Pondicherry.
Yeah, I think the interesting bit also is Lakshmi, like as you're saying, right? These places are all like they're 50 to 60 kilometers apart from each other, and you see so many like different settlements, right? We are talking around the same time, the like 17th, 18th century when the colonial powers were here. But like you see, one of them was Dutch, then another one was Portuguese, and in this case, French
Yeah.
settlement, and even the local rulers are also in the mix, right? So also kind of speaks to that, right? Yeah, thanks so much for calling that out. And basically, you were looking to hit Pondi perhaps end of that day to make a night halt. Yeah.
Yes, so Pondicherry was obviously the night halt. So, between Chennai and Sadrangapatnam and Alamparai, it kind of takes a lot of time. I would love to linger more in, Sadrangapatnam or in Alamparai itself. But, there's another very interesting place on the way to Pondicherry, a little further from Alamparai. I mean, it's got nothing to do with colonies as such, but it's like, it's where you could see a lot of salt fields, people, it's called Marapakam, and it's great for photography. Huge salt everywhere, like, it's like a monotone, full of white. Everything looks white for a moment. So yeah, so we went there, and then of course we went to Pondi, and it was almost late evening, so just tucked in, had a great dinner, and relaxed. Went for a walk along the beach, listened to the waves, and decided to explore Pondi the next day. So in Pondi, we of course visited. We did a walk with Intact. They do a brilliant walk, and they kind of tell you some of the the colonial heritage. But even otherwise, if you just walk around French India, those streets, if you admire some of the architecture there, the art there, get some amazing cafes, you go to the Aurobindo Ashram. And then there are also places, around Pondi, which are very fascinating, which are old settlements. So, but for me, I think more than Pondi, it was Kadlur, which was my next halt. That was very fascinating. So after chilling for 2 days in Pondi, we drove to Kadlur. Kadlur is very close to Pondi. And Kadlur is a very, very ancient town. Kadlur is heartland. And, Pondicherry is anyway a union territory, right? So we're back in Tamil Nadu when we come into Kadlur. So Kadlur itself means the ur by the Kadal, the land near the sea. And it's a very ancient land. and it's also an industrial town. It's also a port. It's a very busy port, and very full of. It's very hustling, bustling all the time. But if you actually, we were looking for, like I said, Fort David, and Fort David was the a fortress of the British when they were. It was part of the British East India Company, because Cuddalore was also one of the foundation of places amongst the East India Company. We wanted to actually look for this place, this building where the British used to work from, or it used to be the center of power. And while we were searching for this place, we couldn't find it in the town. Nobody's even heard of it. And so we went all over. We looked around it, and then finally someone said, "Why don't you go near the old harbor?" And then when we went to the old harbor by the Gadilam river, we actually saw it was very busy. People, there was a lot of fish being loaded on little ferries, and it was quite a chaotic place there. Nobody seemed to know. Then we were just slowly, we started walking around, and then finally we took a little detour, and then we found these entire, suddenly we were in a different world. And there were these really, really, really ancient old houses. Some of them looked straight out of those booth bungalows kind of, sets. Broken mantles, and you could almost sense the atmosphere changed. And then we continued walking, and that's when we found a really, really old house. And there was a little plaque there which said, Fort St. David, and it mentioned that this was the seat of, the British. There was a family in a church nearby who were actually maintaining it. They allowed us to go inside and take a look. It was not well kept, but it was not crumbling like Alamparayan thing, but it was not really well kept. Obviously, nobody knew about it. But they told me a very interesting story. So they said that this port was initially, under the Marathas, and it was later bought over by the British. So and apparently, so there was this tussle, as those days there were no boundaries or areas to mark how much of this land is owned by British. So what they did is, apparently they just the purchase was decided based on a shot from a gun. So they actually the area was actually decided which came under the range of the cannon. Whatever area came under it became a part of the British settlement. And so that whole, it was just one gun shot that decided, how much land was going to be taken over by the British. So, I mean, of course, these are stuff of legends and stories, and how much of it is history we wouldn't know. But it was interesting to know about these things. And like I said, in the middle of nowhere, I mean, here there was a busy, bustling town full of, ferries and people loading fish and loud. And here it's like silence and quiet and stories and booth bungalows. So it was a different experience altogether in Cuddalore for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's fascinating about that story of a way of determining the area which comes out of the British rule, I guess, right? Or when they got that settlement. And also the contrast, right, between Fort St. David and Fort St. George, Chennai, basically Cuddalore and Chennai, and how differently it's panned out as well between the two. I mean, it's still a bustling town, like you said, but definitely nowhere near to what Chennai eventually has become, right? So that's also key highlight of trips like this, right, where you're actually peeling off a lot of layers and trying to travel back a little bit in time as well, right, for lack of a better word. You're trying to like roll back the years and explore all of these lost towns and how they are in relation to the modern day neighborhoods and the towns. So wonderful. Let's take a quick commercial break at this point, and we'll be right back. We're back, and we're chatting with the traveler par excellence, Lakshmi Sharath, about her journey about exploring the Coromandel Coast. So, Lakshmi, where are we going on from here?
So my main thing was to go to Tranquebar, because I wanted to stay in Tranquebar for the night. Tranquebar doesn't really have too many places to stay. There's just one Neemrana property there. and but it's a very fascinating place, and I'll come to that later. But on the way to Ranguba, we wanted to stop at this little town called Porto Novo. Porto Novo is a Portuguese settlement. I think if I'm not wrong, this is the besides Santhome, which was the, like as I said, part of Chennai, which was a Portuguese settlement. This was the other Portuguese settlement in Tamil Nadu, and in Tamil it was called Parangipete. Parangis was a word referring to Europeans. So that's why they said, like one of the teachers whom I met, a school teacher, he said this is where the Parangis stayed, and that's why we called it Parangipete. He said when I was having a cup of coffee at a local stall out there, and but the thing is, like I said, Porto Novo, again another little beach town, and today it's virtually. I mean, it doesn't seem. At least when I searched, I didn't find any monument or anything which is reminiscent of the colonial era. But I was told that it was a trade center for the Arabs and the Yemenis, and and it was also later on after the Portuguese. They called it Porto Novo, and then it was colonized by the Dutch and the British eventually. And I was also told that here there was a mint, so there was so the Nawab of Orkot, the local ruler, he minted the Porto Novo pagoda. It's a gold coins that came from here. So nothing much in Parangipete. It was mostly, by then it was also getting very hot and very humid because we were there late afternoon, because Kadlur had taken a lot of my time. Hunting and looking for Fort David and getting the experience. Thank God I didn't have any haunted story to tell you, but I did feel like I met some of the ghosts of the past. But Parangipete was more of a, it was just I felt it was mostly humid, and so we just continued on our way towards Tranquebar or Tarangambadi.
Tranquebar, okay. Yeah, Parangipete, land of the Parangis. I wonder if like Firangi also sounds very similar, right? It probably was similar route. I don't know. I'm just speculating here, but sounds like that's what you're saying it means in Tamil, right? The land of or where the Europeans stayed.
Yeah, apparently Parangis was a reference to Europeans. So maybe Firangi,
Right.
Parangi, they rhyme, of
Sounds very
course.
similar. Yeah, like once you say that, it just rang that bell. But yeah, cool. Another one of those small little sleepy towns with a lot of backstories, and glad that you could actually learn a little bit more about that, and also connections like this one seems to be a little unique from the others in terms of the Arabs and the Yemenis and people from the Gulf, basically, right? Also having a lot of trade. I mean, primarily you would expect that on the west coast of India, like they usually had a lot of trade there, but it's good to know that even place on the east coast, a lot of the Arabs and Yemenis actually
Oh yeah,
did trade.
They were here in Pulicat, which was another Dutch settlement, which is part of border between today's Andhra and Tamil Nadu, and the Pulicat
I see.
Lake, which is very popular there. There also you'll find a Dutch fort cemetery, but the Arabs were known to have been there much earlier. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think wherever there was trade, you would find the Arabs. So.
Really, really wonderful to find that out. And yeah, tell us a little bit more about your next pit stop. Even this one, right? Tranquebar is a very unique one. I guess just like how French is. I'm sorry, how Pondicherry is synonymous with the French East India Company and their role in settlement. Tranquebar is also famous for the Danish settlement there, right?
Yes.
So tell us a little bit more. I know we did a episode not too long ago focusing just on Tranquebar and spending time in Tranquebar, but yeah, tell us a little bit more about your experience there.
So the first time I went to Tranquebar was with was not on this trip. It was with my classmate from school. We did a little, both of us. She was in US and we were meeting after many years, and we just decided we'll just drive down to Tranquebar, and we had no clue where Tranquebar is at that time. It was not a tourist town. We had nothing, we just decided to drive, and then and that's when I spent a lot of time with the locals there. This was just after the tsunami, so they were trying to reconstruct a lot of homes there. A lot of monuments had broken. Tranquebar had just a handful of streets, if you know, right? I mean, so we did a walk with the intact people who were doing some work there, and then of course there was a Neemrana property, So at that time there was nobody. It was just us, and I think that the intact team and some locals. There was no tourists, nothing. And those 2 days that I stayed with her, and it kind of I felt like coming back. So that is how when the Coromandel, in fact, Tranquebar was what triggered this whole Coromandel colony trail, because having gone with her and done the intact walk, and I've said I've been to Pondy so many times, but I've never really been inspired to do this long road trip, and I, after my first trip to Tranquebar with her, I felt like I should do this trip and explore the other places. So Tarangambadi is a Tamil word for Tranquebar, and it actually means the town of the singing waves. And if you're actually sitting by the waves, you can literally hear the music coming from there. But it was actually a Danish settlement, like you said, and they say that the fort that was here was built by the Danish East India Company. And unlike other forts that I have seen, this definitely has a very Scandinavian feel to it in terms of the architecture. You could even there's a museum now, and it tells you the whole story of how this busy port, one erstwhile busy port, has now become a windswept village. So, like I said, I redid the walk again, because the first time we did the walk, it was mostly like it was, like I said, they were just reconstructing the village back from the tsunami, and they were doing up some homes, and they had some model houses and things like that. So this time it was a little more structured. So they actually take you straight from the main portal, the portal where you still see the gate, which the Danish have written, and you can see the royal Danish seal out there. And then you go through, and as you drive, you can see, there are many streets, and you can see some of the colonial bungalows. You can see the ancient churches. You could also see the kind of old homes, the whole what do you say, the bungalows of the governors, right. Both the Danish governor and the British governors bungalows you can see out here. And the story goes that in 1620, that is I think the 17th century, there was a Danish fleet that just landed here. And I don't know whether they landed here by design or by default. And when they came here, the captain felt that this was a great place to have a strategic trading post. The village was then ruled by the Nayaks, actually. So even now, if you're along the seashore, you can see a very, very old temple. It's one of the oldest temples there. The tsunami has literally destroyed it quite a bit. And but the Nayaks from Tanjavur, which is close by, they were ruling over it. And then there was a deal that the British admiral and the local king had, and then they took over this. So this guy told me this intact that the rent at that time, it was actually leased initially. It was not they didn't own it; they just leased it. And apparently they took a rent of rupees 3,111. This is what he told me. Okay, and then Tranquebar was created, and the Danish fort was built there. And then eventually, the Danes didn't want to continue, and they sold it to the British. There was no war, unlike with the French and the Dutch.
Sure.
I think they just decided it's not their game, so they just sold it to the British, and it became eventually a British settlement. But even now, you can see the old streets from the Danish era. You could see the King Street. You can see the Queen Street. The names are still there, and a lot of these buildings have been restored. So it's very interesting that there's so much of stories in Tranquebar. Another very interesting story is there's the story of the German missionary, for instance, and he actually even translated the Bible into Tamil. He was the first to do that, and so you could see the Zion Church there. It's the oldest Protestant church, So that is something that's interesting. So there are a lot of little nuggets of stories in Tranquebar. There's a bit of Scandinavian influence. There's a German influence. There is, of course, the historic Nayaks and the Vijayanagara Empire influence, and then there is the the British, and currently the whole milieu has changed with a lot of Tamil culture coming in, and it's becoming another tourist town.
Yeah, very, very unique indeed. And yeah, I'm glad you got to go back to the place many times over, right? So that's great as well. But what was planned after your stay here? Because you said you were here for a couple of days, right, Lakshmi?
Yes, I stayed for a couple of days. But to continue with the Coromandel colonies, my next halt was Karaikal. So Karaikal, so all this while we are in Tamil Nadu, right? So from Ponti, we're back in Tamil Nadu. We've come into Kadalur and, and Trankuba, Pargipete, and Tarangambadi. And these are all Tamil Nadu. So now I'm entering again the Union Territory of Pondicherry. So interestingly, Pondicherry is not just Pondi, right? I mean, there is, it has smaller cities or towns, as you call it, but they are landlocked in other states. So Karaikal, for example, is landlocked in Tamil Nadu. There's Mahe in Kerala. There's Yanam in Andhra. So Karaikal is we went from Trankuba to Karaikal. It's very close by. And it's a French colony, obviously, since it's a part of Pondi. But like any other colonies, they had the Dutch and the British fighting over it. But by and large, it remained the colony of the French. But there's a very interesting story of the Karaikal Ammayar, there. And it's a story of, there's a whole legend around it. And I mean, if you're interested, I could tell that story.
Yeah, definitely.
So there was this trader. So Karaikal, I told you, was a trading port, and there was a local trader, and so he had a daughter, and he was, he prayed to Lord Shiva, and they say because he was childless for a long time, and then he prayed to Lord Shiva, and he got this daughter as a boon. She was married, and she, to another trader's son, and they were living very happily. And one day somebody sent 2 mangoes to her husband, and he sent it home and told her that he'll come for lunch and to serve it during the lunch. In the meanwhile, there was Lord Shiva who visited their home in the form of a disguised like a mendicant, a saint, and so she didn't have anything to give him, so she gave some rice that she had prepared for her husband, and she gave one of the mangoes. So he was very happy, he blessed her and he left. So the husband came home for lunch, she served him the rice, she served him the mango, and he wanted the other mango. And she didn't know what to do. So she went back and she found another mango there, and she was surprised, and she prayed to the god, and she just gave it to her husband. The taste was so good, he wanted to know why it's so different from the first mango, and he wanted to know the truth. So she eventually told him the truth, which he didn't believe. So he said, if the god had given you the mango, I want to see the mango too. So she prayed and she held her hand out, and it is believed that there was a mango in her hands. But when the mango was given to her husband, it vanished from his hands. So he suddenly realized that his wife was not an ordinary woman, that she was a saint by herself, and he just, out of respect, he just decided to live separately or move away. However, she waited for her husband. She kept on waiting, wondering why he had left her. And finally, the relatives took her to him. He was living in a different town. But as soon as he saw his wife, he became, completely overwhelmed that he actually fell at her feet and said, you're not an ordinary woman. You're not my wife. I can't have a married conjugal life with you. You're a saint to me. You have the power of goddess. You're a goddess by yourself. And so from that time, she's always been referred to as Karaikal Ammai, the goddess of Karaikal. And Karaikal itself means, like as I said, cradled by the sea, in Tamil. And there are various versions of the story, but this is one of the stories in a nutshell. Like I said, all these towns, while they have a very strong colonial story of colonial connection, they also have a very strong heritage. They also have, that whole area is filled with temples. There are so many temples there. Karaikal Ammai's story is one of the more popular ones. You can actually go to a temple. There's a temple also for her.
Yeah, one of the prominent temples also, right, in Karaikal. So it's great that you actually got to make a stop here as well. And then beyond Karaikal, what was the next stop that you had planned, Lakshmi?
So finally, the last stop was Nagapattinam.
Okay.
So Nagapattinam for me was where I wanted to, take a. I wanted to explore more because Nagapattinam has a lot of history to it. There are churches there and there are monuments there. But mostly for me, Nagapattinam also has a Buddhist connection.
Okay.
Yeah. So I wanted to explore that side of Nagapattinam. It was also a very well-known naval port during the Chola period. There are places around Nagapattinam like the Nagore Dargah. A
Sure.
little further down, you see Annai Velankani. We went there as well. So these are Annai Velankani is one of the very very famous churches. Then there is Shiva temples again, like as I mentioned earlier. So we spent some time doing more of the regular sightseeing, but I hope to go back to explore more of the Buddhist connection. In the 11th century, they believed to be a monastery that was built there. So I don't know if any of it remains, but I want to go back and do a little bit of research there.
Yeah, definitely. And sounds like a very interesting place as well. Like you've said, with all the other connections as well, even before the colonial powers got here, but even for the colonial powers, right? It is believed to be the primary Dutch settlement starting from 1690. They basically moved it from Pulicat to here from 1690, and even later on, when the Britishers took this over, it served as the capital of the Tanjore district, right?
Right.
After they took it, yeah, as a part of the Madras presidency. So that way also it's been a very significant place. And I think the other theme that you'd see across these the coast, right, basically the Coromandel Coast and even these different ports or the settlements that you passed through, Lakshmi, was the impact of the 2004 tsunami, right? A
Yes.
lot of these were, some of them smaller, but otherwise, even some bigger settlements as well were basically fishing hamlets, right? A lot of these fishermen and their families lived around the coastlines, and Nagapattinam, I believe, is one of the most impacted as well from the tsunami. A majority of the casualties from that 2004 tsunami were in this district. So the tsunami also is, it's not visible, but that's another thread that connects this coast, right? The devastation that it brought, and that
No,
is also still seen, right? You probably
yeah,
saw that in
not
some
just
of
the
the
tsunami, but countless cyclones after that as well, because
right.
Nagapattinam is
Yeah,
always ravaged along, while Pondi and Chennai also bear the brunt of it. This is also one of the most ravaged district, and the entire coast. I mean, all of it. They've really live, in fear of the cyclones because the cyclone doesn't just cause minimal damage. It literally, it creates havoc, and
yeah,
it's not just about loss of lives or property alone. It's the fear, it's the constant fear that people tell me, that it's like, okay, there was one tsunami, but after that, every cyclone, every year that they have to deal with, and especially since these are, like you said, fishing hamlets, people live and, by the sea, and they also die by it, unfortunately.
yeah, definitely. But I'd really like to thank you, Lakshmi, that you've literally taken around this virtually you've taken around this road trip of yours, and I appreciate the fact that you've actually looked beyond this just as a road trip, but you've looked at these various threats that connect it as well, right? Primarily the Coromandel colonies or the colonial settlements that the coast has had, and trying to dig deeper into that and finding the stories, the different connections, and a lot of the urban legends and stories associated with that, bringing those out and beautifully tying all of those together. Because otherwise, if you look at them individually, yes, you might look at them and move on to the next one. But looking at this holistically, I don't think we would have imagined without you actually having done this trip. So thank you so much. It was a real pleasure having you. Like I said, it's been due a long time, but really glad that we could bring you on, and especially bring you on and discuss such a fascinating journey, a fascinating trip.
Thank you so much, Seth, for this amazing podcast. It made me literally relive this trip. It's very special to me because not only because it's my home state, but also, like I said, there's so many stories here. There is the ancient heritage, the Cholas, the Vijayanagar, and the whole the Shiva temples. It has a lot of historic and legendary temples and shrines and legends, and then there is the whole European history and the whole folklore around it. I forgot to mention one very, very important historic place, and I think a story on Tamil Nadu and the coast, the whole Coromandel Coast is not complete without it. The story of Pumbuhar. Puhar is a very, very, very old, ancient port. It was known as Kaveri Pumbattinam. It's been written about in ancient Tamil literature, in Sangam literature. It was served as the early capital of the early Chola kingdoms in the Sangam era. It's always been described as the port flourishing, full of riches, pearls. I mean, it's supposed to be one of the most beautiful and most prosperous port towns ever. But apparently, it was destroyed. There's a legend which says that our town was destroyed and kind of got swallowed by the ocean, and it's completely destroyed. But the interesting thing is, Pumbuhar is also where the Kaveri actually meets the ocean. It's the final estuary. It's a final meeting point. It's the end of the amazing river's journey. And Tamil Nadu is, for Kaveri is more than just a river. It's a goddess. She's a goddess. But this is where Kaveri meets the ocean. And I went there just to see that little spot where she actually joins the sea. And it was so quiet. It was so beautiful. For a moment, it was like everything just ended at that one point. If there was one ending point for me, although this is technically not the ending point from a geography point of view, but for me, from a moment, I think that meeting point of the river and the ocean, I think that was something very poetic. It gave me a lot of peace just standing there and seeing. Because this is where history, legends, poetry, art, literature, and nature and spirituality kind of blends in that one little meeting point. So Pumbuhar is special.
Yeah, definitely. I think a great way to cap off that wonderful trip you've done as well. It's definitely worthy of it and feels surreal given the confluence of these different things and not just the confluence of the Kaveri into the ocean, right? So thank you so much, Lakshmi. It was wonderful chatting with you, and no wonder you're so highly appreciated even in the travel fraternity. It is stuff of legends, right? This is what you are, and this is what your stories and your travel blog and everything is all about. It's not easy to recreate, and you bring so many different things like this to life. So thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have you, Lakshmi. Looking forward to chatting with you soon.
Thank you. I'm really honored again. Thanks.
That was yet another great episode on the Musafir Stories. Make sure to show us some love by sharing the podcast with your friends and family. We are on Instagram and Twitter at Musafir Stories. If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM podcast app or the website. Follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram.